5 Hollywood legends, 16 years, all passed away from cancer after filming one movie in the Utah desert. Dick Powell, Pedro Armendariz, Agnes Moorehead, Susan Hayward, John Wayne. What they didn't know, they were standing 137 miles from where the government detonated 11 atomic bombs. This is the story of the movie that glowed in the dark. John Wayne, the Duke's final battle. Among those who arrived completely unaware was Hollywood's biggest star, a man who seemed invincible in every way that mattered. John Wayne stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 200 pounds of solid presence. He was, by 1954, the very embodiment of American masculinity, tough, straightforward, and seemingly indestructible. His career had spanned decades, from B-westerns in the 30s to major war films and prestige pictures. Audiences couldn't conceive of a world where John Wayne didn't triumph in the end. When he arrived in Snow Canyon to play Genghis Khan, Wayne approached the role with complete commitment despite the obvious miscasting. He spent long days in the desert heat, riding horses at full gallop, engaging in staged sword fights, and throwing himself into the dusty ground for action sequences. Wayne never did anything halfway. His physical approach to filmmaking meant he was constantly in contact with the desert environment. He breathed deeply. He sweated through his costumes. He sat on the ground between takes. And when his children came to visit the location, they played in that same sand, building castles and running through the formations while their father worked. The shoot wrapped. The film was released in 1956 to savage reviews and disappointing box office. Critics mocked Wayne's portrayal. The audience stayed away. The Conqueror was quickly recognized as one of the great misfires in cinema history. Wayne himself would later call it the worst film he ever made. But in 1956, bad reviews were the least of the problems this production would create. Years passed. Wayne continued his career, churning out westerns and war films at a prodigious rate. He smoked constantly, by most accounts, 6 packs of cigarettes a day, an addiction he'd maintained for decades. In 1964, he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Surgery removed the lung and surrounding tissue. Wayne recovered, returned to work, and publicly attributed his cancer to his smoking habit. But the cancer returned. Stomach cancer this time, requiring more surgery and more complications. Through the late 60s and into the 70s, Wayne battled his failing body while continuing to work when he could. He was gaunt, struggling, clearly ill, yet he maintained his public persona, the tough guy who wouldn't quit. By 1979, the cancer had won. On June 11th, John Wayne took his final breath at age 72. In his final interviews, he never publicly connected his illness to the Conqueror. He blamed the cigarettes. He talked about his long career. But according to those closest to him, Wayne had begun to wonder. When word started circulating in Hollywood circles about the unusual number of Conqueror cast members developing cancer, friends noticed Wayne growing quieter when asked about the film in his final years. While he never made a public statement connecting his cancer to that Utah desert, those intimate conversations suggested a man who was beginning to suspect the truth. The pattern in his own family was impossible to ignore. His son Michael, who had visited the set during production, later developed cancer. When Michael was diagnosed in his 50s, his daughter later said he would sometimes stare at that childhood photograph and wonder, just wonder. His daughter Aisa also developed cancer after spending time at the Snow Canyon location. 3 members of the Wayne family, all connected to the Conqueror, all struck by cancer. The silence, how a pattern went unreported for 25 years. As Wayne's health declined through the 1960s and 70s, something was happening behind closed doors in Hollywood and Washington that would keep the public in the dark for decades. Through the 1960s, cast members from The Conqueror began falling ill. In 1963, just 7 years after the film's release, director Dick Powell was diagnosed with lymphatic cancer. He was 58 years old, still actively working in Hollywood. His decline was swift and brutal. By January 2nd, 1963, Hollywood lost one of its most respected directors. That same year, Pedro Armendariz received a diagnosis that would devastate him. The rugged Mexican star, just 51 years old, learned he had kidney and lymphatic cancer that had already spread extensively through his body. Doctors gave him months to live. On June 18th, 1963, unable to face the slow deterioration ahead, Armendariz ended his own life in his UCLA hospital room. 2 major Conqueror stars have gone in a single year. In 1972, Susan Hayward was diagnosed with brain cancer. She fought through seizures and multiple surgeries while trying to continue working. By 1974, she could barely walk. On March 14th, 1975, the cancer won. She was 57. That same year, 1974, Agnes Moorehead, the beloved Endora from Bewitched, succumbed to uterine cancer at age 73. She had been diagnosed while still filming her television series and had hidden her illness from most of her colleagues, determined to work until the end. And then, in 1979, John Wayne, the biggest star of them all. Hollywood lost its most enduring icon at 72 from cancer that had ravaged his body for 15 years. 5 major Hollywood names, all from the same film, all developing cancer, all gone within 16 years of the film's release. These were people whose names appeared in headlines, whose losses generated obituaries in every major newspaper. Yet through all of this, through 2 decades of cast members falling ill and leaving this world, not a single newspaper, magazine, or industry publication connected the dots publicly, not one investigative reporter looked at this pattern and asked the obvious question: what did these people have in common besides appearing in the same movie? The silence was deafening and deliberate. No studio launched an internal investigation. No insurance company went public with actuarial concerns, though they surely must have noticed that policies on Conqueror cast members were paying out at unusual rates. Hollywood's powerful publicity machine simply ignored the pattern entirely. Why? The answer likely involves a combination of factors, none of them flattering to the institutions involved. For RKO Studios, acknowledging a connection between the film location and cancer would open them to massive legal liability. They had chosen the location. They had transported the radioactive dirt back to Hollywood. Meanwhile, Susan Hayward was developing the headaches that would signal her brain tumor. She had no idea that while lawyers worried about liability, her own countdown had already begun. For the federal government, acknowledging that their safe nuclear testing had contaminated large areas and potentially caused cancer in civilians would undermine their entire Cold War narrative about the peaceful atom. As government officials calculated political risk, Pedro Armendariz was living his final healthy years, riding horses and making films, completely unaware that cancer was already growing inside him. If the Conqueror cast members were indeed victims of fallout, what about all the other people living downwind from the Nevada test site? The implications were staggering, and for Hollywood as an industry, there was simply no incentive to investigate. Film productions had always been rough on participants. Drawing attention to safety failures would invite regulation, oversight, and liability. Better to say nothing and hope the pattern went unnoticed. So through the 60s and 70s, as the toll mounted, the silence held, and smaller names, crew members, extras, technical staff, were falling ill and leaving this world with even less attention. Finally, in 1980, a full 25 years after filming had wrapped, and with most of the victims already gone, People magazine published an investigation that broke the silence. The article detailed the extraordinary cancer rate among the Conqueror cast and crew. By their count, 91 of the 220 people who had worked on the production had been diagnosed with cancer. 46 of them had already left this world. The article prompted Dr. Robert Pendleton, a professor of biology at the University of Utah, to conduct his own informal analysis. His finding: the cancer rate among the Conqueror cast and crew was approximately 3 times higher than would be expected in a group of that size and age range. Even accounting for smoking, alcohol use, and other risk factors common in Hollywood, the rate was extraordinarily elevated. Dr. Pendleton's findings received limited attention. There was some brief media coverage, a few follow-up articles, but no congressional hearing was convened. No official government investigation was launched. No comprehensive medical study undertaken. The pattern was acknowledged, then quietly filed away. By 1980, justice was already impossible. Most of the victims were gone. Howard Hughes himself had left this world in 1976, a recluse who would never answer questions about the production. Any contemporaneous documents about the location scouting or knowledge of radiation levels had either never existed or had long since vanished in the dissolution of RKO Studios. The victims and their families received no compensation, no official acknowledgement, and no answers. The silence that had protected institutions for 25 years had achieved its purpose. Susan Hayward, the red-haired fighter who lost. While the silence persisted through the 1960s and 70s, Wayne's leading lady was fighting a battle she would ultimately lose. Susan Hayward had built her career on playing strong women. Born Edith Morener in Brooklyn in 1917, she had clawed her way up from poverty to become one of Hollywood's most respected actresses. 5 Oscar nominations across 2 decades. 1 win for I Want to Live in 1958, where she played a woman facing the gas chamber with fierce dignity. In The Conqueror, Hayward played Bortai, the Tartar princess who becomes Genghis Khan's bride. It was a nothing role in a terrible film, but Hayward approached it with her characteristic professionalism. She spent weeks in the Utah desert, performing in heavy costumes under the scorching sun. She was 37 years old during filming, at the peak of her physical powers. Hayward was known in Hollywood as a fighter. She had battled studios for better roles. She had fought through a difficult divorce. She was tough, resilient, and seemingly unstoppable. In 1972, 18 years after filming The Conqueror, Hayward began experiencing severe headaches and occasional seizures. The diagnosis was brain cancer, specifically an aggressive tumor that had already begun spreading. For a woman who had made her reputation playing fighters, this was the ultimate test. She refused to quit. Even as the cancer progressed, even as she underwent multiple surgeries that left her weakened and partially paralyzed, she tried to keep working. By 1974, her condition had deteriorated dramatically. She could barely walk without assistance. Her speech was affected. The vibrant, fierce woman who had commanded the screen for decades was being systematically destroyed from within. Yet she remained determined. Friends from this period reported that she never lost her spirit. Her final public appearance came at the 1974 Academy Awards ceremony. Hayward had been asked to present the Best Actress award. By this point, she could barely stand on her own. She had to be helped to the stage by two men, one supporting each arm. The audience, seeing her frail, trembling figure, rose in a spontaneous standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Hayward stood there, visibly fighting for composure, acknowledging the tribute with a slight smile. She presented the award to Ellen Burstyn for Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore and was helped off stage. It was the last time most of the world would see her. Susan Hayward left this world on March 14, 1975. She was 57 years old. She had fought for 3 years, undergoing surgery after surgery, never giving up until her body simply couldn't fight anymore. The tragedy didn't end with her. Her second husband, Eaton Chalkley, whom she had married in 1957, also developed cancer. He left this world in 1966, just 9 years into their marriage. Hayward had been devastated by his loss, and some friends suggested her own health began its slow decline from that point. More haunting still was the pattern in her twin sons from her first marriage. Both Timothy and Gregory Barker later developed cancer. Gregory survived after brutal treatment. Timothy was not as fortunate. 4 people intimately connected to Susan Hayward, all touched by cancer. Her family would never believe it was a random chance. Hayward's final year was spent in pain, confusion, and increasing helplessness, the exact opposite of every role she had ever played. Yet according to her few visitors in those final months, she never complained. She remained, to the very end, a fighter who simply ran out of strength. Pedro Armendariz, the warrior who chose his own end. Hayward's loss in 1975 came 11 years after another cast member made a choice that shocked Hollywood. Pedro Armendariz was Mexico's greatest film star, a man whose career had made him beloved across Latin America and respected in Hollywood. Born in Mexico City in 1912, he had appeared in films by legendary directors including John Ford and Luis Buñuel. When The Conqueror cast him as Jamuga, Genghis Khan's blood brother and eventual rival, it seemed like an ideal role for his talents. Armendariz and John Wayne had become close friends working together on Ford's films. They shared similar personalities. Both were physical, masculine men who took pride in doing their own stunts and living life fully. When they reunited in the Utah desert for The Conqueror, they spent their downtime riding horses, telling stories, and enjoying the male camaraderie that both treasured. In early 1963, 9 years after filming Wrapped, Armendariz began experiencing severe pain. The diagnosis was devastating: kidney and lymphatic cancer that had already metastasized throughout his body. At 51 years old, he was told he had perhaps a few months to live. For a man like Armendariz, this was more than a medical catastrophe. His entire identity was bound up in his physical strength, his masculine vitality, his ability to live boldly and choose his own terms. The prospect of wasting away slowly in a hospital bed, of becoming weak and helpless, of losing control of his own body and dignity, this was unbearable. To him, he was admitted to UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles, where doctors tried to manage his pain. But Armendariz could see where this was heading. Every day he was weaker. Every day the pain was worse. Every day he was less of the man he had been. On June 18, 1963, Pedro Armendariz made his final choice. He had somehow managed to smuggle a weapon into his hospital room. In a final act of will, he chose to leave this world on his own terms with a single shot to the chest. He left behind a brief note explaining that he preferred to depart as himself rather than as a shadow of what cancer would make him. His choice shocked Hollywood and devastated the Mexican film community. At 51, he should have had decades ahead of him. Instead, just 9 years after working in that Utah desert, he was gone. Adding to the tragedy, Armendariz's son, Pedro Armendariz Jr., who would go on to his own successful film career, later battled cancer as well. Another family touched by the disease. In the shadow of The Conqueror. If you're finding this investigation into one of Hollywood's most troubling chapters revealing truths you've never heard before, please subscribe to Golden Age Files. We honor these stars by telling the complete truth of what they endured, not just the glamorous images studios wanted us to see, but the full, complicated, often tragic reality of their lives and careers. Dick Powell, the director's burden? Armendariz's loss was the same year another Conqueror casualty fell, but his story raised different questions about responsibility. Dick Powell's transformation from 1930s singing star to serious actor and respected director was one of Hollywood's great career reinventions. Born in 1904, Powell had starred in wholesome musical comedies. By the 1940s, tired of being typecast, he fought his way into dramatic roles. By the 50s, he had moved behind the camera, directing ambitious projects. The Conqueror represented Powell's most elaborate directorial effort yet. Howard Hughes had given him a massive budget, major stars, and a sweeping historical epic to bring to life. As director, Powell was intimately involved in every aspect of the production. He spent weeks in Snow Canyon, working closely with cast and crew, setting up shots, directing action sequences. His hands-on approach meant he was constantly in the desert environment, walking through the dust to check camera angles, sitting on the sand to review takes, breathing the air just like everyone else. When location scouting had raised the question of where to film, Powell had been part of the decision-making process. According to some accounts, there had been brief discussions about the proximity to the Nevada test site. The Atomic Energy Commission had been contacted, and they had provided assurances that fallout levels were negligible and posed no health risk. Powell, like everyone else, accepted these official assurances at face value. In 1962, just 7 years after The Conqueror wrapped production, Powell was diagnosed with lymphatic cancer. For a man of 58 who had been healthy and active, the diagnosis was shocking. The decline was rapid and merciless. Dick Powell left this world on January 2nd, 1963. He was 58 years old. He left behind his wife, actress June Allison, and their children. He also left behind a question that would haunt some who knew him. Had he suspected, in those final months, that the location he had helped choose had contributed to his illness? As director, Powell bore a unique burden. He had been responsible for the production. He had been the one ensuring everyone's safety on set. He had accepted the government's assurances about radiation and passed those assurances along to his cast and crew. Friends later reported that in his final weeks, he seemed troubled by something beyond his illness, asking questions about other cast members' health. Whether he had connected the dots before his passing, we'll never know for certain. Powell's loss, coming so soon after the production at a relatively young age from a cancer that struck suddenly, would prove to be the first in a series of similar cases. He was the canary in the coal mine, the first warning sign that something was terribly wrong. But in 1963, with the silence around The Conqueror still holding firm, his loss was treated as a tragic individual event, not as part of a larger pattern. Agnes Moorehead, the secret she carried to her grave. Powell and Armendariz left this world within months of each other in 1963, but they wouldn't be the last. A decade later, another cast member was hiding her own battle. Agnes Moorehead had already enjoyed a distinguished 25-year career by the time she appeared in The Conqueror. Born in 1900, she had been a respected stage actress before transitioning to Hollywood in the early 1940s. 4 Oscar nominations, memorable roles in classics like Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons. By the 1960s, she had found new fame as Endora, the scene-stealing witch mother on the hit television series Bewitched. Moorehead was known in the industry as a consummate professional, meticulous about her craft, disciplined in her work habits, and fiercely intelligent. She had studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and earned a master's degree in public speaking. Directors knew that when they cast Agnes Moorehead, they were getting someone who would show up prepared, hit her marks perfectly, and elevate every scene she was in. Her role in The Conqueror was relatively small. She played Hunlan, a Mongolian character in the court intrigue surrounding Genghis Khan's rise. At 54 during filming, Moorehead was already well established, bringing gravitas to even a minor role in a troubled production. The weeks she spent in Snow Canyon were, by her later accounts to friends, unremarkable at the time. The heat was oppressive, the location was remote, the script was problematic, but these were standard Hollywood production challenges. She did her job, collected her paycheck, and moved on to the next project. Through the 1960s, as her career flourished with Bewitched, Moorehead began hearing the whispers. Dick Powell, her director, gone in 1963. Pedro Armendariz, her co-star, gone that same year. According to Paul Lind, who worked with Moorehead on Bewitched and became a close friend, she started keeping a list sometime in the late 1960s. She would read the industry obituaries, and whenever she recognized a name from The Conqueror, she would make a note. The list grew longer. The pattern grew more obvious. By 1974, Moorehead was still working steadily on Bewitched, which was then in its final season. At 74 years old, she was still vibrant, still bringing energy and humor to her role as the mischievous Endora. That year, she was diagnosed with uterine cancer. The diagnosis was kept quiet. Moorehead insisted on continuing to work, hiding her illness from most of her cast and crew. Only a few close friends knew she was sick. According to Dick Sargent, who played Darren in the later seasons of Bewitched, Moorehead confided in him during this period about her fears and suspicions. She told him she believed The Conqueror was cursed, that everyone connected to the film was paying a price. She mentioned Dick Powell's loss in 1963. She knew about Pedro Armendariz. She was aware that Susan Hayward was battling brain cancer at the same time she was fighting her own illness. Sargent later described these conversations as haunting. She would get this look in her eyes, he said. Not fear exactly, more like resignation. She said she'd been watching it happen for years, watching people from that film get sick and die. She said she always wondered when it would be her turn, and now it was. According to Sargent, sometime in the late 1960s, Moorehead had actually contacted RKO Studios to ask if anyone had investigated the health outcomes of The Conqueror cast and crew. She was told, politely but firmly, that the studio had no records of any health issues related to the production. She had also written a letter to a Los Angeles newspaper in 1970, suggesting that someone should investigate the unusual number of cancer cases. The letter was never published. She told me she felt like Cassandra, Sargent recalled, referring to the mythological figure cursed to speak true prophecies that no one would believe. She could see what was happening. She understood the pattern, but she couldn't get anyone to listen. Moorehead was an intelligent woman who paid attention to patterns. 20 years after filming in that Utah desert, she was fighting cancer, and so were others who had been there. The coincidence seemed too remarkable to ignore. But publicly, she said nothing more. Agnes Moorehead took her final breath on April 30th, 1974, at age 73, a spring morning in Rochester, Minnesota, where she'd sought treatment at the Mayo Clinic. She was gone less than a year after her diagnosis. Weeks earlier, she had confided to Dick Sargent her belief that the desert had ended them all and that no one would ever admit it. Her final episodes of Bewitched aired posthumously, showing a vibrant, energetic Endora who gave no hint of the suffering woman behind the performance. She had connected the dots years before the public would. She had recognized the pattern. She had lived with the knowledge that her illness might be connected to a film she had made 2 decades earlier. She had even tried, in her limited way, to raise the alarm. Yet she never spoke publicly about it, never tried to hold anyone accountable in a sustained way. Her silence in the face of her own suspicions makes her story all the more tragic. She left this world knowing, or at least strongly suspecting, what had taken her life, but powerless to do anything about it. The forgotten victims, names history never recorded, while Moorehead and the major stars garnered headlines when they left this world. Dozens of others suffered in complete obscurity. His name was never published in People magazine's investigation, but he was 34 years old in 1954, a stuntman who'd worked on dozens of films. Let's call him Tom Jenkins, not his real name, because his family's privacy matters, but his story deserves to be told. Tom had a wife, 2 young daughters back in Burbank. He'd survived the war, worked on productions from westerns to comedies, never had a sick day in his life. In 1968, just 14 years after that Utah shoot, Tom was diagnosed with leukemia. He told his wife it didn't make sense. He was healthy, young, strong. The cancer moved fast. He left this world before his 42nd birthday. His daughters were still in high school. His widow would later tell People magazine that Tom had talked about the Conqueror in his final weeks, wondering aloud if that desert dust had something to do with it. She never got answers. Tom Jenkins wasn't alone. A makeup artist, healthy throughout the production, was gone at 42. A horse wrangler left this world at 39. A costume assistant who'd just married, planning to start a family, gone before her 45th birthday. The complete cast and crew of The Conqueror numbered 220 people. We remember the famous names: Wayne, Hayward, Moorehead, Powell, Armendariz. Their losses made newspapers. But what about the grip who spent weeks moving heavy equipment through clouds of dust? The driver who transported supplies? The costume assistants who cleaned sand-covered garments daily? The horse wranglers who spent all day in the open desert? The caterers who prepared meals in the open air? The makeup artists who applied and removed makeup from faces covered in desert dust? By 1980, when People magazine conducted their investigation, 91 of these 220 people had been diagnosed with cancer. That's 41% of the entire group. In a normal population of this size and age range, you would expect roughly 30 cancer diagnoses over a 25-year period. Instead, there were 91, 3 times the expected rate. Of those 91 diagnoses, 46 people had already left this world by 1980. That's 21% of the entire cast and crew gone to cancer within 25 years of the production. But while the famous names are remembered, the others remain largely anonymous. These were people with no power, no platform, no public voice. When they got sick, there were no newspaper articles. When they left this world, there were no Hollywood tributes. Their families were told it was an unfortunate coincidence. Dr. Robert Pendleton's 1980 analysis attempted to bring scientific rigor to the question. His finding that the cancer rate was approximately 3 times the expected norm was based on conservative estimates and standard epidemiological methods. Even accounting for factors like smoking rates in Hollywood, alcohol consumption, and other lifestyle risks, the rate remained dramatically elevated. Dr. Pendleton's findings gave these forgotten victims something they'd never had: scientific validation. 3 times the expected cancer rate wasn't a coincidence. It was evidence. These weren't random tragedies. They were casualties. The famous stars, at least, had their losses investigated by journalists. The crew members had only Dr. Pendleton's statistical analysis to prove their suffering was real. But even Dr. Pendleton's careful work received limited attention. A few follow-up articles in newspapers, some discussion in academic circles, then silence. No major medical journal published a comprehensive study. No government agency followed up with a full investigation. And here's what haunts researchers today. People magazine could only confirm 91 cancer cases out of 220 people. But their investigation was conducted in 1980, just 25 years after filming. What about the crew members who developed cancer in 1985, or 1995, or 2005? What about slow-growing cancers that took decades to appear? The real number could be 100. It could be 150. It could be nearly all of them. We'll never know, because no one in authority cared enough to keep counting. The forgotten victims of The Conqueror remain a reminder that Hollywood's golden age had distinct class divisions. The stars are remembered, the workers are forgotten. The families, cancer's shadow across generations. The tragedy didn't end with those who worked on the film. It may have followed them home to their families. That photograph of Michael Wayne, 8 years old, hands black with Utah desert dust, building a sandcastle while his father watched in full Genghis Khan costume, hung in the Wayne family home for decades. When Michael was diagnosed with cancer in his 50s, his daughter later said he would sometimes stare at that photo and wonder, just wonder. One of the most disturbing aspects of the Conqueror story emerges when you look beyond the cast and crew to their immediate families. John Wayne's children, who visited the Snow Canyon set, Susan Hayward's twin sons, Pedro Armendariz Jr., Eaton Chalkley, Hayward's husband, multiple spouses and children developing cancer and families connected to the production. The pattern raises haunting questions. Could radiation exposure have affected family members who were never on the set? Could contamination have been carried home? The science suggests it's possible. Radioactive particles are not like ordinary dirt. Dust contaminated with radioactive isotopes can cling to fabric, lodge in hair, settle in the creases of luggage and equipment. When the Conqueror cast and crew returned home after weeks in Snow Canyon, they may have brought contamination with them. That photograph of Michael Wayne wasn't unique. Susan Hayward kept similar photos, her twin boys visiting the set, playing in the same sand. Pedro Armendariz's son remembered his father coming home from the shoot, dust still in his hair, lifting him up for a hug. These were normal family moments, loving moments. But every hug, every shared meal, every goodnight kiss might have transferred invisible particles from parent to child. Consider a typical scenario. A costume assistant spends her days handling elaborate outfits dragged through the desert dirt. At the end of each workday, she bathes to wash off the dust. But some particles remain in her suitcase, on her clothes, in her hairbrush. When the production wraps and she returns home, those items come with her. Her children play with her luggage. Her husband hugs her, breathing in dust from her hair. Invisible, impossible to detect, and potentially dangerous. Now multiply that scenario across 220 people, and then consider that an estimated 60 tons of desert dirt were transported to RKO Studios for interior shooting. Cast and crew spent months working on sound stages covered with that imported sand, and then they went home to their families every evening. The most documented cases involve children who actually visited the sets. John Wayne brought his kids to see him work. Michael Wayne, Asa Wayne, and other family members who spent time on location later developed cancer. Susan Hayward's situation is even more tragic. Her husband, Eaton Shockley, developed cancer and left this world in 1966, just 11 years after the film was made. Both of her twin sons later battled cancer. 4 people in Susan Hayward's immediate circle: herself, her husband, both sons, all struck by cancer. One family, 4 cancer diagnoses. Pedro Armendariz Jr., who went on to become a successful actor, appearing in several James Bond films, also battled cancer later in life. Can radiation exposure damage DNA in ways that affect children? The answer, from studies of atomic bomb survivors, is that it can. Radiation can cause genetic mutations that may increase cancer risk in the next generation. Whether the exposure levels in Snow Canyon and the RKO Studios were sufficient to cause such effects remains unknown because no comprehensive study was ever conducted. Gregory Barker, Susan Hayward's surviving son, rarely speaks publicly about his mother's passing or his own cancer battle. When reached for comment in the 1990s, he said simply, "I think about that Utah desert every time I go for a checkup." He's in his 70s now, a cancer survivor, still getting regular screenings, still wondering. That's the legacy the Conqueror left for the second generation. Not certainty, but endless wandering. In 1980, when the pattern became public, a comprehensive epidemiological study could have been launched. Researchers could have tracked down family members, documented cancer rates, examined medical records. Such a study might not have provided definitive proof of causation, but it would have at least documented the full extent of the tragedy. Instead, no such study was undertaken. The families were left with their suspicions, their grief, and no answers. The shadow of the Conqueror extended across generations, but no one in authority cared enough to measure how far it reached. But why? Why was no study conducted? Why did no one in authority act? To answer that, we need to examine what the government actually knew about the danger and when they knew it. The science, what the government knew and when they knew it. Before we conclude this investigation, there's one crucial question that demands an answer. What did the Atomic Energy Commission actually know about the danger, and when did they know it? The standard narrative suggests that in 1953, when the Conqueror was being planned, nobody understood the risks of fallout. The government was still learning. The science was uncertain. This narrative is comfortable because it removes culpability. If they didn't know, they couldn't be blamed. But the documents tell a different story. By 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission had already conducted extensive studies on fallout patterns from the Nevada test site. Internal memos, some of which were declassified decades later, show that AEC scientists understood perfectly well that radioactive particles were being deposited across vast areas of Utah, Nevada, and Arizona. More damning still, they knew which isotopes were present in the fallout and understood their potential health effects. Let's talk about what was actually in that Utah desert dirt in 1953. The 11 atmospheric tests conducted at the Nevada test site in 1953 released multiple radioactive isotopes into the environment. The most significant were iodine-131, strontium-90, and cesium-137. Each presented distinct dangers. Iodine-131 concentrates in the thyroid gland and can cause thyroid cancer. Its half-life is only 8 days, meaning it decays relatively quickly. By the time The Conqueror, filmed in summer 1954, most of the iodine-131 from the 1953 tests would have decayed. But here's what the AEC knew and didn't share. Even after decay, the damage to thyroid tissue could persist for years. Strontium-90 is more sinister. It mimics calcium in the body, meaning it gets absorbed into bones and teeth. Once there, it continues emitting radiation for decades. Its half-life is 29 years. Every person who worked in Snow Canyon in 1954 was being exposed to strontium-90 every time they breathed the dust, every time they touched the sand, every time they ate a meal prepared in the open air. Cesium-137, with a half-life of 30 years, distributes throughout soft tissues in the body. It can cause multiple types of cancer depending on where it concentrates. The Atomic Energy Commission had data on all of this. They had measurements of fallout deposition. They had maps showing which areas received the heaviest contamination. And Snow Canyon was well within the zone they internally classified as having received significant fallout. So when Dick Powell's production team contacted the AEC asking about safety, what were they told? According to available records, the AEC provided vague assurances that radiation levels were negligible and posed no health risk. They did not share their internal data. They did not mention the specific isotopes present. They did not explain the concept of biological accumulation, how radioactive particles, even in small amounts, can concentrate in specific organs and cause disproportionate damage. This wasn't ignorance. This was a calculated decision to withhold information that would have changed the production's choice of location. Why would the AEC do this? The answer lies in understanding the political climate of the time. The Cold War was at its peak. The hydrogen bomb had just been tested. The American public needed to believe that nuclear weapons were not only necessary but safe, that the government could test these weapons on American soil without endangering American citizens. Admitting that large areas of Utah and Nevada were contaminated with dangerous levels of radiation would have undermined this entire narrative. It would have suggested that the testing program itself was reckless. It would have invited lawsuits, compensation claims, and political backlash. So when a Hollywood production came asking about filming in a contaminated area, the AEC faced a choice: tell the truth and risk public awareness of the contamination, or provide reassuring lies and hope nothing went wrong. They chose the lies. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. The AEC wasn't just passive in their deception. According to documents uncovered by journalist Howard Ball in his research on downwinders, the AEC actively monitored fallout patterns and knew within hours when tests deposited heavy contamination on populated areas. They had procedures for warning residents when contamination was detected, but those warnings were discretionary, not mandatory. In the case of Snow Canyon and the surrounding area, no warnings were issued after the 1953 tests. Residents in St. George, Hurricane, and other nearby towns were never informed about the contamination levels. They continued their normal lives, drinking milk from local cows that had grazed on contaminated grass, eating vegetables from gardens dusted with fallout, breathing the air, playing in the dirt. When the Conqueror production was set up in that same area a year later, they were walking into a contaminated zone that the AEC knew about but had never publicly acknowledged. One of the most chilling documents from this period is an internal AEC memo from 1955, just 1 year after The Conqueror wrapped production. The memo, written by an AEC health physicist, discusses growing concerns about cancer rates in areas downwind from the test site. The physicist notes that elevated cancer rates may become apparent in populations exposed to multiple years of fallout and recommends careful monitoring of health statistics in affected communities. This memo was marked classified and would remain secret for over 30 years. While it was being written and filed away, Dick Powell was directing his next film, completely unaware that he had perhaps a decade to live. Pedro Armendariz was making movies in Mexico, not knowing that cancer was potentially growing inside him. John Wayne was smoking his 6 packs a day, unknowingly adding insult to injury his lungs may have already received from radioactive dust. The AEC knew that monitoring should occur. They knew cancer rates might rise. They knew that people had been exposed, but they told nobody. They warned nobody. They monitored nothing. In 1965, just 2 years after both Dick Powell and Pedro Armendariz had passed away, the AEC conducted an internal review of health effects from Nevada testing. The review acknowledged that significant populations had been exposed to fallout and that some increase in cancer rates may occur. But this review too remained classified. No public announcement was made. No effort to contact potentially affected individuals was undertaken. By 1980, when the Conqueror story finally broke publicly, the evidence of AEC knowledge and deliberate deception was already substantial. But because so much time had passed, and because the agency had hidden its data so effectively, proving causation in individual cases became virtually impossible. This is the real crime of The Conqueror. Not just that people were exposed to radiation, but that the exposure could have been prevented if the AEC had been honest. Dick Powell could have chosen a different location. The cast and crew could have been warned to take precautions. The 60 tons of dirt need never have been transported to Hollywood studios. Instead, the AEC chose secrecy over safety. They chose political convenience over human lives. And when people started passing away, they chose continued silence over acknowledgement and accountability. Dr. Robert Pendleton, the University of Utah biologist who analyzed the cancer rates in 1980, was blunt in his assessment. The Atomic Energy Commission knew that area was contaminated. They had the data. They made a conscious decision not to warn people. That decision may have cost dozens of lives. The AEC's successor agency, the Department of Energy, has never officially acknowledged any connection between the Nevada test site and the Conqueror casualties. They maintained that radiation levels in the area were within acceptable limits, though they have never explained what made those limits acceptable or who decided that uninformed civilians could be exposed to them without their knowledge or consent. In 1990, when Congress passed the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, they included specific geographic areas and time periods that qualified for compensation. Residents of certain downwind counties who developed certain cancers during certain years could receive payments of $50,000. But the RECA legislation specifically excluded anyone who wasn't a permanent resident of the affected areas. Film crews who spent weeks in contaminated zones didn't qualify. Workers who transported contaminated materials didn't qualify. Family members who were exposed secondarily didn't qualify. The Conqueror victims fell through every loophole the legislation created. Today, 70 years after those 11 atmospheric tests in 1953, we can look at the full scope of the AEC's deception and understand it as part of a larger pattern. The agency repeatedly chose to minimize, conceal, and deny the health effects of nuclear testing. They did it to the soldiers exposed during weapons tests. They did it to the uranium miners who developed lung cancer. They did it to the downwind residents, and they did it to the cast and crew of The Conqueror. The science was never uncertain. The government always knew. They just chose not to tell. The legacy, what changed and what didn't. Knowing what the Atomic Energy Commission knew and understanding how they chose secrecy over safety, we can now ask, out of all this tragedy and unanswered questions, did anything change? Did their suffering mean anything? After the 1980 People magazine investigation brought the Conqueror story into public awareness, some changes did occur in Hollywood. Studios began implementing more rigorous location safety protocols. Environmental testing became more common before remote shoots. Insurance companies started demanding information about potential environmental hazards. The casual assumption that any scenic location was safe gave way to more careful evaluation. These were genuine improvements. Future productions would benefit from the heightened awareness of location safety that The Conqueror had forced into the industry's consciousness. Beyond the film industry, the Conqueror story contributed to broader public awareness of nuclear testing consequences. The Conqueror casualties helped undermine the government's peaceful atom narrative. Their story humanized the abstract concept of fallout. It put famous faces on the consequences of nuclear testing. This skepticism helped fuel activism around the rights of downwinders, civilians who lived in areas affected by fallout from the Nevada test site. Their efforts eventually resulted in the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act of 1990, which provided financial compensation to certain categories of individuals exposed to nuclear testing or uranium mining. The Conqueror story, while never resulting in compensation for its victims, helped create the political climate that made such legislation possible. In 2023, a group of downwinder families filed a new class action lawsuit against the federal government, arguing that the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act should be expanded and extended. If they succeed, could the Conqueror families finally seek compensation? The window is closing. Most victims are gone. Most families have aged. But the fight for acknowledgement continues. In film schools, The Conqueror became a cautionary tale taught to future filmmakers. It appears in discussions of production safety, location scouting, and the responsibility directors and producers have for their cast and crew. As for the RKO sound stages, where that 60 tons of contaminated dirt was spread, the studio lot was eventually sold and redeveloped. Whether anyone ever tested those stages for radiation before demolition remains unknown. Another question that will likely never be answered. Today, in 2024, only a handful of the 220 cast and crew members might still be alive, most well into their 90s if they survived. The youngest would be in their late 80s now. The window for their stories is almost closed, forever. Yet for all these positive developments, the central injustice remains unaddressed. No official government investigation was ever conducted. No congressional hearing was convened. No comprehensive medical study was undertaken. The Atomic Energy Commission never acknowledged any connection between their testing program and the Conqueror casualties. Most significantly, the victims and their families never received compensation, apology, or official acknowledgement. The 46 losses documented by 1980 were simply accepted as tragic but unactionable. The Atomic Energy Commission never had to answer for what they knew and when they knew it. The documents showing their awareness of contamination, their decision to withhold information, their choice to prioritize Cold War propaganda over civilian safety, all of this remained hidden for decades, emerging only long after most victims were gone. The legacy of The Conqueror is thus mixed. Yes, the tragedy led to improvements in safety protocols. Yes, it contributed to broader awareness of nuclear testing dangers. But no, justice was never served. No, the victims were never officially honored or compensated. No, the full truth was never established through rigorous scientific investigation. What we're left with is 91 cancer diagnoses from 220 people. We're left with 46 confirmed losses, and likely more that went undocumented. We're left with families torn apart, careers cut short, and suffering that could potentially have been prevented. We're left with John Wayne at 72, privately wondering if that Utah desert had contributed to his end. Susan Hayward, unable to walk at 57, fighting until her body gave out. Agnes Moorehead, whispering to friends that she believed the Conqueror had cursed them all. Dick Powell, gone at 58, troubled by questions about his cast members' health. Pedro Armendariz, facing such unbearable deterioration that he chose his own exit at 51, and we're left with the forgotten victims. Tom Jenkins and others whose names we don't know. The crew members whose families were told it was bad luck. The 46 who left this world, and the 45 survivors of cancer diagnoses who carried their scars in silence. Their legacy is incomplete, their justice denied, but their sacrifice should never be forgotten. The Conqueror remains one of Hollywood's greatest embarrassments, a miscast epic that lost millions at the box office and became a punchline in film history. But The Conqueror's real legacy isn't its artistic failure. It's the 46 lives it may have taken, the 91 cancer diagnoses it may have caused, the families it may have devastated, and the questions that remain unanswered 70 years later. We'll never know with absolute certainty if that Utah desert ended them. No definitive scientific study was ever conducted. The kind of rigorous epidemiological investigation that could have established causation beyond reasonable doubt was never undertaken. But we know this. 91 cancer diagnoses from 220 people is 3 times the expected rate. We know the location was 137 miles downwind from atmospheric nuclear testing. We know 11 atomic bombs had been detonated the year before filming. We know an estimated 60 tons of potentially contaminated dirt were transported to Hollywood studios. We know the AEC had data showing the area was contaminated, but chose not to share it. And we know that people like Agnes Moorehead believed in their final days that they understood what was ending their lives. The evidence is circumstantial, but overwhelming. The correlation is undeniable, even if causation can't be definitively proven, and the pattern is too dramatic to dismiss as mere coincidence. These 10 stories we've told, John Wayne's long battle and his wondering, Susan Hayward's fierce fight until the end, Agnes Moorehead's quiet knowledge and whispered belief, Dick Powell's burden of responsibility, Pedro Armendariz's tragic choice for dignity, Tom Jenkins and the forgotten crew members, Michael Wayne's photograph and the families touched by the shadow. These are only part of the full picture. There are 36 more cancer victims whose stories we haven't told. Which part of this story has affected you most? The famous stars whose legacies were cut short? Tom Jenkins and the forgotten crew members whose names history barely recorded? The families who may have been contaminated simply by association? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know what other untold Hollywood tragedies you'd like us to investigate. The Golden Age had so many secrets, and we're committed to bringing them into the light with respect, rigor, and truth. The Conqueror was supposed to be Howard Hughes' masterpiece. Instead, it became his greatest shame. He was so embarrassed by the film that he eventually spent millions buying up prints, trying to bury it, but the film's failure was the least of his sins. The real crime was choosing that location and potentially condemning hundreds of people to fates they never deserved. The cast and crew of The Conqueror trusted Hollywood's golden dream. They trusted that someone in authority was looking out for their safety. They trusted government assurances that fallout from nuclear testing was negligible. That trust may have ended 46 of them and scarred 45 more with cancer they had to fight and survive. This is the Golden Age Files, where we honor the complete truth of the stars who built our dreams, including the nightmares they may have endured to create them. The stars of The Conqueror shine no less brightly for what they may have suffered. John Wayne remains an icon. Susan Hayward's performances are still captivating. Agnes Moorehead's Endora still delights new generations. Dick Powell's film noir work still influences directors. Pedro Armendariz's Mexican cinema legacy endures. But they also deserve to be remembered as victims of a system that valued spectacle over safety and maintained silence when truth was demanded. They deserve the justice they never received and the answers their families still seek. Thank you for watching, for listening, and for remembering their sacrifice. The 46 who left this world, the 45 who survived cancer, and the 129 who escaped diagnosis but spent decades wondering. All of them deserve our respect and our commitment to never let such a tragedy happen again. The Conqueror may have been Hollywood's worst film, but if their story prevents even one future tragedy, then perhaps their sacrifice will have gained the meaning it never had while they lived. Don't forget to share and give this a like. Until next time, may we never forget the price some paid for the magic we still enjoy.